Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Austin Smedley. I'm the features desk editor here at The Breeze and a writer for The Baseline. This is the debut episode of Beyond the Well. It's going to be your spot for any religious or spiritual topic because people just don't talk about things like this enough. And like I said, I'm your host, and we have here with us...
Hey guys, my name's Emmanuel. You can go ahead and catch me on Instagram at Manny Vargas, Nirvarize, and I thank you so much, Austin, for having me on this topic and podcast.
Appreciate it, man. Appreciate it. It's very fitting. We talk about this stuff enough as it is.
Why not make a show out of it?
Yeah, really. This is basically what I kind of had for an idea for this is basically a platform because, again, people don't talk about this enough. Mm-hmm. So as this is the first episode, I think we should get into the background of the occult specifically because that's my area of expertise. Now, in the modern age, like starting from the 60s onward, 1966 to be specific, Anton LaVey, he's a former carny and crime scene photographer for the San Francisco Police Department. Interesting dude.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, interesting guy. He, in his wife, is his partner towards the end of his life, Blanche Barton. She wrote a biography about him called The Secret Life of a Satanist. A lot of stuff in there. But so I think it'd be a good idea to talk about Satanism, or LaVeyan Satanism in particular, because it is the first official religion in the history of the United States that was founded, in the name of Satan, so to speak. So I'd like to ask you, because I love to talk about this stuff with people who don't know, or people who do know, because they're also very insightful. What is your definition of Satanism? Like, what is it to you?
All right, so my definition of Satanism, my first idea, I'm going to talk about it prior to getting into it. I actually got into it. I was interested in it when I was younger. At least I would want to say like between the ages of like 12. But prior to that, I thought that the idea of Satanism was like sacrificing and like bloodcraft, pacts, special rituals that require special candles and like roses, special locations. Yeah, the good stuff, like the thing you see on TV. And then that's pretty much what I thought. I thought it was the worship of an evil entity to save yourself in whatever manner it may be. I always thought that it was a form of saving yourself from regardless of who you pray to. So when I first started researching it, that's what I got. It wasn't until a couple like clicks here, a couple clicks there, and a couple videos here is until I finally realized what it truly was and when it was actually officially started. Because I didn't realize, I thought it was something that was old. I thought it was something that was passed down, like kind of like the Bible, right? So it's like information from information to information from centuries. It wasn't until I realized that, oh wow, this is actually pretty modern. Mm-hmm. Within the turn of a century, right, or within the turn of 100 years, this was concocted up and finally came to surface. But I was still kind of confused because, granted, it's more modern, which kind of threw me off. So it had modern ideals, and so when I first looked into it, I still kind of initially thought that it still had to do with like sacrificing and everything and all that.
Like everyone.
And I honestly thought that was like the true form of it. And I thought that this modern Satanism, LaVey Satanism, I thought that was kind of like bullshit. I thought it was like, oh, well, you're just taking modern day ideals and you're labeling them this, and this. Yeah.
It's interesting because you say, repackaging and whatnot. That's actually a pretty common term when used with LaVey. A lot of parts of the Satanic Bible, released in 1969, of course. 69. It was released that year, and a lot of it took inspiration from people like Ragnar Redbeard, for one. Might is right. So there are a lot of elements of and Ayn Rand too. A lot of it is repackaged Ayn Rand and Ragnar Redbeard's writings on just whether it be political systems or just way of life. They're pretty similar, and LaVey got away with it for a while, but people found out eventually. But you kind of hit the nail on the head there with self-preservation, because that itself that's self-preservation is a big one. Saving yourself and whatnot. A lot of people don't realize it, but Satanism isn't about the worship or the worship of a devil or of any kind, especially not the one from the Bible. A lot of people say, well, if you don't believe in God, how can you believe in Satan? It's like, well, because they don't believe in either one. Speaking as somebody who called themselves a Satanist for a long time, how I can explain Satanism to someone who doesn't know it is Satanism is the worship of yourself because you're responsible for your own good and evil. It's kind of a play on something Marilyn Manson said, because he actually met Anton once, or actually a couple times towards the end of his life. But it actually stems from left-hand path and right-hand path. Like those two terms are kind of how you distinguish between a religion like Satanism, which is very self-centered and atheistic in nature, as opposed to an Abrahamic faith like Christianity or Islam. The difference being is that the right-hand path a believer in a right-hand path religion externalizes the concept of God as something to worship, revere, and submit to. Submission being the point there. Islam literally translates into submission. Contrast that to the left-hand path, in which the concept of God is internalized. It's a lifelong process of self-deification, rather than looking towards a source that, is beyond you, beyond your understanding, and looking to that to be saved. That's kind of the basis there. And that's really Satanism, especially LaVeyan Satanism. There's other versions of it like Setianism and Luciferianism, which are they have a lot of similar elements, but they branch off from each other in certain ways. The historical impact, that's a big one, because Satanism, as it was founded in 1966 by Anton LaVey, really set the stage for modern occult practitioners, in that the Satanic Bible outlines a lot of the basics of occult practice, a lot of the ridding yourself of guilt that you had built up your entire life if you grew up in a Abrahamic religious household. Like Christianity, like I did, for example. Did you grow up in a religious household?
Actually, yeah. For most of my life, for the first 13 years of my life, I grew up Catholic. Yeah. And it wasn't until, I finally, I decided to take matters to my own hand and say, well, I'm making these decisions consciously. I never made the decision to practice this faith. So I'm going to step out. And that's where I stepped into Satanism, which is what kind of pulled me out a bit. And it made me, really think about things and just kind of put things into perspective. But I never fully joined. It was just something that caught my eye.
Yeah, well, one of the misconceptions, that especially post-1997, which is the year Anton LaVey died, even though for 15 or so years before his death, he became a recluse. He opened the church in 1966, and one of the misconceptions, too, is that the Church of Satan isn't actually a building. Anton LaVey purchased the property in San Francisco of California Street called the Black House, that he would, I believe it was weekly, for a couple of years leading up into the 70s, he would hold what he would call his magic circle. And he would give lectures on all kinds of topics, ranging from Eastern mysticism to, I think he even talked about cannibalism on a couple occasions. This guy lived a very interesting life, had an affair with Marilyn Monroe when they were both very young, was involved with Jane Mansfield and all of that before she died as well. So he got around. He definitely got around. And that just pretty much started. That was the start of all the misconceptions, because he got shredded in the media. You name your religion Satanism, that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole reason it's actually called Satanism isn't because they worship Satan. Rather, just like the Black Mass, it's a play on Catholicism.
Mm.
It's almost the reason why they named Satanism is honestly just to piss a lot of people off, which I think is hilarious. People,
do you think in return that also brought people in too? I mean, aside from pushing them away, they're like, oh wow, finally something I believe in.
Yeah, it kind of worked as a filter too. The word Satan kind of worked as a filter, because it separated those who were serious about it as opposed to those who were just kind of interested in checking it out.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of those. The Church of Satan, especially now with Peter H. Gilmore at the head of it, their membership prices keep rising up, and there are still no grottos. There are still no places for Satanists in them, under the banner of the Church of Satan, official members to meet up, to do ritual together. You have to do that completely, entirely on your own. The Church of Satan's not a physical building. You can't go and meet anybody there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would be nice.
That's funny. I thought it was a building.
Yeah.
I literally thought it was a building.
Well, you call it a church. What do you think?
That's true.
The Church of Satan is more of an, Nicholas Schreck said it himself with an interview. I believe it was with Bob Larson. He said the Church of Satan isn't a building. It's more of an idea, which is very much the case, except now, especially with the internet having taken prominence within the last 20 years or so, you don't even need that. You don't even need it anymore. Whatever idea you can think of, especially in regard to the occult, organizations like the Sect of the Horn God, which I myself am a member of. Sect of the Horn God, they're a fantastic group of folks. They have forums and stuff like that where people can meet and discuss. It was one of the many reasons the Church of Satan seemed to fall out of favor with many people in the occult post 1997. I think that's really the big one there. One of the branches, too, like I mentioned earlier, was Setianism, which was a branch in the 1970s, 1975, I believe. Michael Aquino, former member of the priesthood of the Church of Satan, he went off and he founded Setianism after a revelation he had, which he believed that the Temple of Set was actually, that was his direction. That's where he needed to go, where he needed to found. Are you familiar with Set at all? Any Egyptian mythology?
No. Visually I can distinguish them, but by name, not really.
It's a shame. Yeah, the Temple of Set, they're interesting. Like I was explaining, we talked about this a little while ago. If you could summarize the Temple of Set in one word, it'd be Kepher, spelled Xeper, and it has multiple forms. So Kefiri, Kephara, and basically what that word means is to come into being, and to come into being through the practices and the becoming of the archetype of Set, which is the Prince of Darkness. What imagery does that put in your head when you hear the Prince of Darkness?
The one and only Satan.
Funny, you're far from the only one who thinks that way too. Yeah, it's interesting. The Prince of Darkness, back in the days of ancient Egypt, Set was one of the most prominent gods of that age. And when they say Prince of Darkness, it doesn't have a negative connotation to it, actually. When they say Prince of Darkness, they literally mean the Prince of Darkness. Like, just, it's dark outside. That's basically it. You can see the stars. And one of the interesting things, too, I don't know if you saw the interview with, there are a couple with Nicholas Xena Shrek, as she didn't want to take her father's name because she wasn't much a fan of him towards the end of his life. But they mentioned that Set, well, somebody asked them, he's like, so what do you think is going to happen when you die? And he's like, well, how can you're so consumed with darkness. It's like the light, when they kind of used some weird little metaphor, when they said something like the light, Nicholas Shrek basically responded with, light is blinding, darkness is illuminating. And I think that's very much the case when you walk outside and it's dark, you see the stars. And when it's dark, when you yourself live in darkness, it's illuminating. You can see, you find light within yourself rather than having to look to something else to find it.
Mm-hmm. That actually makes a lot of sense. And also thinking about like the certain situation and perspectives that they have. Because if you wouldn't have said that would have not made any sense. I would have been some mumbo jumbo. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, what do you mean dark is light and light is dark? But now that you place that into perspective, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Because when you do walk outside and you see it's bright as fuck, you close your eyes. The first thing you do is you cover. And I think that the reason it makes a lot more sense, and from previous conversations that we've had, the way I see the darkness is a place of like creation, a place of exceeding amounts of space. Right? You can't really dignify how much space there is in a dark area because, well, one, like the Schrodinger effect, or the Schrodinger cat experiments, you don't know if it's alive or dead. So you don't know how much space there is. So it's all based off your perception. I actually really like that a lot. Yeah. If they would have said, oh, hey, you're the light in the darkness, you trying to join Satanist club? Like, I'd be like, yeah, I'm down. Oh, why not?
Yeah, not to sound too Tumblr-esque or anything. That sounded very... the darkness is illuminating. Yeah, it can sound a little goofy if you throw a little spin on it. But it's I think it's a very inspiring concept because a lot of people... one of the foundations of the left-hand path and Satanism in particular is that you're born into it. This idea has carried a lot of historical relevance, especially in the modern age, and people are accepting who and what they are and are refusing to live in fear, are refusing to live their lives filled with guilt, that living in a Christian or Islamic or Catholic household, people are rejecting that in droves these days, especially with, our generation, the millennial generation, and Generation Z following. I wonder how bad it's going to get with them, or we'll see the pendulum effect. Who knows? But a lot of people, education is playing a big part of it. You mentioned that a couple times, and I definitely would agree with you. And I would also quote Xena and Nicholas again because I think they're brilliant folk, especially with what they're doing now. They're Buddhists now. I believe they're tantric Buddhists, and living off in Germany. I'm jealous. But
that's a very interesting path.
Tell me about it. I know. And she mentioned that Benjamin Franklin, all the great innovators of the world, have been considered evil, especially ones of antiquity, ones that were around 16, 17, 1800s that were, Enlightenment had come and gone. However, religion was still very much at the center of the show when it came to making political decisions and being exiled and stuff like that, which are goofy concepts to us now, but they were very real back then. And Benjamin Franklin, for one, when electricity came about, when Richard Wagner with his music, a lot of these people were not accepted by the church. Friedrich Nietzsche, of course. I mean, he wrote excoriating books about them on many different topics and reasons, slave and mass morality and all that. But any innovator was viewed as being satanic because it was that which was not understood yet. Now, with our modern understanding of all these things, with science and the prominence of those fields, our perceptions are changing a little bit. How do you feel about that? Would you say that's accurate?
I would say that's very accurate, and I think it's changing in a very great way. We're allowing ourselves to kind of educate ourselves, compare and contrast, and then ultimately make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we've had the ability to globally say, hey, this is all information we have about our specific religion, our ideals, and our philosophy. Let's compare it to what you have, right? I mean, America is barely being introduced to Western culture or Eastern culture, medicine, philosophy, like you said, Buddhism, all that stuff, all the things that require energy or the idea of energy and self-care. I think education is playing a really huge part. And I do agree with you. I think that we're stepping in the right direction. We're allowing ourselves to be transparent with our stuff. And we're finally saying, hey, well, we have all these clues. Now that everybody's globally connected, let's piece it together.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then you said technology as well. You
Technology.
said all that stuff. I think I've said this in another podcast or just out of conversation off the record. Technology, the idea of technology and how we progress in technology, and the idea of like faith and religion. I think once we mesh those two together, I think we'll finally be able to excel and like you can quote unquote say transcend.
Yeah.
Because now we've taken everything we learned from here, all the pros and the cons that can apply are applicable in our real world life, with everything that exists, and then everything that we can possibly do on the technology side, a lot along with like morals, studies, concepts, and if we just mesh those two, we can possibly like get something good, right? So
I would have to agree there. Yeah.
The cons, I think, of like technology nowadays with religion and faith is that we tend to grip tightly to morals and ethics, which is, I think, reasonable because we are very morally driven and ethic people.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue with that is that because of that, technology is being hindered. So obviously, there's a very shitty example, World War II, when the guy who created the gas to gas the Jews initially had a different approach to that project. He was actually aiming to do something else, but something happened to where he ended up splitting the hydrogen, and it wasn't his goal either to make it odorless. That was on accident. That was all accident. The Germans came. They raided his stuff. He tried to destroy as much as it can and just left. It saved him and his family. And then the Germans got a hold of the gas that they used to gas the Jews. That is really shitty. That is really, really, really shitty. And that was just like an outcome or like chain reaction. But because of that, now we can pump hydrogen into our soil to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's like, all right, the morals are obviously not there, but killed millions of people. And then like immorally, and then morally, it's feeding millions of people, right? How much do we rely on this?
Yeah.
So circling back around to, we are headed in a very great direction. We're allowing ourselves to be open about it. We're not allowing ourselves to be tied down by these faiths or these ideals that have been perpetrated for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, I think we are heading in the right direction. I think education is a very important aspect into understanding faith and religion.
I absolutely would agree with that. And also, one of the reasons, Christianity, Islam, they have obviously built empires and they've been very successful. However, they were successful because of subjugation. They were successful because of submission. And within Satanism, I call it carnal common sense, because Satanism, it's, especially in the 9 satanic statements, responsibility for the responsible, so to love, waste, and all ingrates. They're very practical life values. And they are also rooted in the 7 deadly sins, sloth, greed, gluttony, things of that sort. They're rooted in very real human characteristics. And we've grown up and we've been taught, indoctrinated, and brainwashed, the whole 4 to 14 window, get them while they're young. We've been raised to believe that all 7 of these things are negative. They're not, though. They're not negative if you are of a responsible and clear head. You can recognize them for what they are. I don't think living your life being told or, we've been brought up to be afraid of the 7 deadly sins, afraid of Satan, afraid of his minions. To be honest with you, and at the same time, we're being taught to be afraid of all these ethereal concepts, yet Father over there is, touching boys in a closet.
Yeah.
That's what should be feared. That's what should be handled with, that's what should be booted out. That's what we should be getting riled up about, not abortion. We shouldn't be getting riled up like we saw in the 80s and 90s with the Satanic Panic. We shouldn't be getting riled up about children's toys or cereals or anything of this sort. Somebody, part of the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel, someone named Seth Andrews, very interesting fella, he gave a speech on that. He talked about the Satanic Panic and how so many different brands and companies were demonized.
Being boycotted over the smallest things.
Being boycotted and you're evil.
But there's one of them that was reasonable. There's one of them that was very reasonable.
Which one? Which one was that?
It was cleaning. It was like they made like cleaners or they made household things. Mm-hmm. And they're like, oh, well, the emblem is, if you look down here, it's inverted 6. And if you look up here, that's like a demonic god or whatever. And then the guy came out publicly and he said, yeah, well, I funded the Satanic Church like millions of dollars.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was like, all right, well, you guys have a definite reason to do that,
That's kind of yeah, I get that. I definitely get that. However, it's this permeating fear all throughout society, especially amongst those who are raised in Christian households. And not to say all those values are bad or negative. People are tackling them with more nuance than have ever been. Modern Christians would be called heretics 100 or 200 years ago and be exiled from the church because you don't lick father's boots enough. But it's definitely changing. The perception of these things is definitely changing. I think Satanism had a lot to do with that. Nicholas Schreck and Xena, call it the pendulum effect if you'd like. One generation is very conservative, the next is very liberal, just use kind of red and blue terms, so to speak. However, they made a lot of statements back in those times, and they referenced the year 2000 to be the Satanic century. And I think a lot of what they said turned out to be pretty true. The New Age movement, people turning away from religion in droves, and a lot of that has to do with education. And like I was saying earlier, education itself was condemned. Women weren't allowed to read scriptures. Weren't allowed to be literate. Early American history, black folk weren't allowed to read. Black folk weren't allowed to be literate or anything of that sort. Education has always been used as a tool to subjugate, whether it's there or not there, or if the church doesn't approve of it, trust me, you're going to hear about it, especially in the early 2000s with evolution. Education has been the enemy of the church for a very long time. Not all of it, but one or elements of it that make Christians afraid or go against what the Bible says. Zena LaVey and Nicholas Strecker hit the nail on the head with that one. People, what was perceived as satanic is now being taught to millions of people all over the world and millions of people in the United States. It's commonplace now. It's commonplace. A lot of the education and revolutionary, so to speak, revolutionary ideas are now accepted as fact because a lot of them are fact. We don't need to be afraid of them anymore, and because we're not afraid of these, we start to lose faith in the church and the whole movement itself because we're starting to realize that perhaps maybe these people were full of shit. Like maybe they weren't as true, they weren't as enlightened as they made it sound like they were.
That's funny that you say that. When you say that, I think of Spotlight, the movie, where they couldn't reveal for like a couple years what the Catholic Church was doing, or the Irish Catholic Church was doing.
That was a phenomenal movie.
But I think that, and I hate after having this discussion multiple times with you, I'm starting to hate the word satanic or Satanism because it doesn't really promote a god, or it doesn't promote somebody you worship. It honestly promotes self-indulgence in whatever it may be, knowledge, food, material things. And I've noticed that, you're a prime example, that you guys value education, or that you guys value the idea of thinking about something, the idea of, hey, well, this is given to me, so I'm going to think about it now. And going back to religion and faith, not to accuse him, I used to think this a lot. I used to think that the Pope, right? So this just jumped that huge ass bridge. The Pope, when I was younger, I used to think he was Antichrist. And my reasoning being not because like, oh yeah, fuck yeah, Satan. I was still Catholic. It was more of, well, if you read the scripture and you read it and you saw that, what is the definition of an Antichrist? Somebody who comes up praising the word of God under his name, his face,
sheep's clothing.
Yeah, right. What is Pope Francis essentially? He's a pope, so therefore, why does he have so much power within the Catholic structure? On top of that, he pardoned every priest, or I think he pardoned somebody who committed some pedophilia act. So at that point, You have to go back and read it and tell
The
yourself.
church is corrupt? No way.
Right?
No way.
And the fact that they have so much information is interesting as well.
Of course.
So
Where do you think the biggest stash of pornography in the world is?
The Vatican,
The
bro.
Vatican.
That's
Don't
funny.
look at this. It's
I've
for
never
my
heard that.
eyes only. You know, and that's honestly one of the things that LaVey spoke at length about back in his day. He spoke a lot about working as a carnival worker, and he played the Calliope, you know, the circus song, the circus song, not the church song. He made those, you know, later in life, but, you know, for a different kind of church. And also, well, to kind of touch on the example real quick, you said you're tired of the word Satan. There also is another reason why Satanists consider themselves Satanists and not just humanists or anything of that sort, because they don't like humanists either. But because Satanism is a very, you know, get yours first, very Nietzschean, Machiavelli kind of philosophy. So Satanism, they call themselves Satanists also because Satan, just like Odin, Thor, Jesus, or whoever, all these creatures considered to be mythology, they resemble archetypes. They resemble archetypes, and they have certain characteristics. And you know, some people are born with the same kind of characteristics. They are also archetypes. When you think of a superhero, when you think of a villain, there's a certain set of characteristics that you have in your mind. This applies to Satan as well. Satan is viewed as an archetype. You know, the rebellious one, the light bringer. That's why education's valued, and education is valued in part, you know, look at the church and how often it's been demonized by them. Of course, Satan, on the other hand, is going to be like, no, these things are all right.
Let alone demonized, it was also controlled. Because you have to think about
controlled.
like 16, 17, 1800s when we started forming like quote unquote like cities and democracies. Who were in charge of like education and
The
stuff
church.
like that? The church. Law, which was one of the biggest forms of education back then. Being able to abide by the law, being able to read the law, being able to write law. People of nobility, primarily people of, you know, faith or religion, had the opportunity to do that. So it makes so much sense. It makes so much sense why, you know, Satanists or Satanism promotes self-education, promotes self-worth, which is something we don't promote in any form of other religion, except for, I can't speak for all of them, most Western religions, right?
Abrahamic faiths, yeah.
Yeah.
The ones that are very prominent here in the United States. It's about liberation of the self. It's about self-preservation. There are definitely some aspects of it that I'm not big on now. Like, because life is to be worshipped and to be preserved at all costs, martyrdom is very much discouraged, I guess you can say, within a lot of satanic circles or the church itself. And I think that's kind of cowardly in a lot of ways. I think it's important for men and women both to believe in something so much that it transcends their love of themselves, because I think that's a beautiful way forward. I'd love to talk about that more in the future for sure, because I think we're getting a revival of that sort of nobility and that sort of approach to life, not just preserving ourselves, but something else beyond that. What do you love more than yourself? If you can't answer that question, oh boy, you might be in a little bit of a pickle with that one. If you don't believe in anything more than yourself, that's gonna be a pretty dull life. Like, what do you have to die for? We're all gonna die at some point. I'd like to not die in a boring way. I'd like to die fighting for something that I truly believed in, and that value is kind of lost on a lot of Satanists. But the basis of it, self-preservation, I think that also is important too. You know, it's important to not put your life on the line for a corrupt system like a church or anything of that sort, because they benefit a lot from you taking yourself out, or you sacrificing yourself, or sacrificing your bank account. That's another one. The whole tithing thing, you know, that's one thing I can give Anton LaVey credit for. The Church of Satan, he said it himself, it's a business. All churches are businesses. A quote from him: all churches are businesses. If the churches were taxed, the national debt would disappear overnight, which I think is very true. Satanism, the Church of Satan, is not a tax-exempt organization. They do pay taxes. Somebody asked me that once, and I didn't know the answer, so
Really?
There you go.
Why do they pay taxes?
Because they recognize that the church is a business. They recognize that. They believe that all churches should pay taxes, which I don't necessarily disagree with.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, we've incorporated so much of our ideas into our government, let alone our money. It says, "In God we trust."
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that we fight it. Yeah, it's so subliminally ingrained in us.
It is.
Church and state. I mean, what's Trump doing? We can't have abortion because it's very morally wrong to the religions, right? Or because everybody, I mean, not to lie, most of the conservatives are religious, which is interesting because when we first started off as a country, Republicans and Democrats were the opposite. Obviously, they flip throughout the years and like how we perceive law and how we develop law. But nonetheless, everybody should follow the same law.
Yeah.
Church and state, separation of church and state.
Yeah, there definitely should be a separation of church and state. And because, a lot of people ask, why is Satanism called a religion? Well, if they don't believe in a god or gods or whatnot, there's still a dogma in place. And a dogma is a very important part of every religious system. There needs to be a dogma there should be a dogma that you adhere yourself to if you really do believe it. But also at the same time, you don't see Satanists taking up signs and saying, you don't see Satanists in power. You don't see Satanists using their belief system and imposing it on others while making moral decisions, which is absurd to me that one religious system, despite how prominent it doesn't matter how prominent it is, not everybody belongs or is under that banner. You can't make a decision within a law system based on the ideas of Christianity or based on the ideas of the Ten Commandments or what have you. Not everybody believes in those things. The whole "in God we trust" thing on our money is, a relic from the Cold War. We're not like those godless commies. But a lot of people get lost in that too. I mean, yeah, we're not like those godless commies. However, communist Russia wasn't godless because, or wasn't, the government was atheistic in nature. They were secular in nature. However, that wasn't to promote atheism. That was to promote the power of the state. The state wanted that worship. The state wanted your money. Instead of the church getting it, now the state's getting it. Mm-hmm. It's really no different in a lot of ways than how it is in the United States. And Satanism represents a rebellion against that sort of conformity. It represents a rebellion against submitting to a church or a government for either of those reasons. You should be able to look within yourself, find the power within yourself to get up and dust off your pants and keep going throughout life, rather than having to go to a church, pay tithes, watch them pocket your money, and give you little to no solution except read this good old book here. We should be able to move beyond that, and it seems as if our society is definitely going in that direction.
Yeah, I just think that because of that and our discovery of other things that we've looked into, I think it's just going to create kind of like a clusterfuck of things, what to believe in, what not to believe in. And then going back to what we were saying earlier, the clusterfuck won't be for a while. Or actually, it will be for a while. What we get out of it, I think, is going to be what we've been looking for. Ultimately coming down to a consensus of, oh yeah, hey, this is it. This is fine. Everything matches up. So if this matches up, then from there we can start off and we can move on to other literature, other forms of books. And it kind of sucks because there's a lot of literature we don't have to make those connections. Yeah. World War II, they burned so many books.
Yeah, there are a lot of excavations and things of that sort. However, what we're beginning to understand, especially with our understanding of evolution and human nature, and now that we're no longer demonizing, at least not as much as we used to, and a lot of our generation is moving beyond the system of antiquity that is the church, moving beyond that system and realizing that our human nature is our nature regardless of whether we like it or not. When we try to suppress, I just keep referring back to the 7 deadly sins. It's a good way to sum up human nature. We keep repressing those things like lust and anger and things of those sort. They have meaning. They are important to us. Anger and love on the same spectrum, just on opposite sides.
Yep.
They're both important. They're both natural to us. We have to recognize and understand that our natural law, again, is our natural law. We will operate on these standards for the entirety of the time that this race is on this planet, the human race. Once we recognize that, we understand that there's really not a whole lot. We can control them, but we shouldn't suppress them, and we shouldn't push them down because they become compulsive. They become ruiners of our lives. If we were to take the time that we use praying them away and running away from them and talking to our pastors and our priests about them, instead take that time and study them. Study them, learn to respect them for what they are, and then we can approach the world on those terms. If we all were to able, and this is very idealistic, but if we were all able to approach life on those terms and understand that our actions, our angers, and things of that sort, they're natural. We all are born with this nature. There's some variations and things of that sort, but for the most part, we all owe it to ourselves and to the world that we live in to respect each other on those terms, and then we can get started. And then we can get started moving on beyond the politics, beyond the churches, beyond the tithing and all that. We are all born under the same banner as human. Let's work together. We don't need to be splitting each other up or cutting each other's heads off or throwing people off buildings because your God looks a little different than mine. Your God has bigger balls than mine does, and that makes me uncomfortable.
It isn't until we fully understand what we're even consuming that we can come to a consensus of like, hey, yeah, we can fucking do this now.
Absolutely. Right. As we can see, been a lot of cultural relevance with the prominence of Satanism being established as an above-board religion, and it seems as if there's going to be nothing, hopefully, nothing but progress from here on out. I appreciate you, Manny. I appreciate you coming on and doing this with me. This is a good place to get started, good background episode.
Thank you so much for having me. I actually enjoy this topic a lot. Not many people like talking about it, and it's not the fact that I enjoy it because of like the content. I enjoy it because of the perspectives, the information and insight that you bring, the various cults that exist, literally. It's all very fascinating. It's information that we are holding ourselves out from. Regardless of what the intentions are, information is information. Information's nor good or bad. It's how you use it. That's where it actually comes into play, whether or not it's good or bad.
Absolutely. It can all be judged on our standards, and it's all relative.
Yeah, the Crusades.
Yeah, really. I am your host once again, Austin Smedley. You can find me on Twitter on Austin Smedley 1. I guess I can't have my full name on any of these platforms. Instagram is Austin X Smedley because again, that stupid inactive account.
It's a bot, bro. They're out to get you, man.
Dude, I know. I'm gonna end up messaging this dude like, hey, can you just change your name real quick so I can go ahead and make it official?
He's like, nah, bud, you can go fuck yourself, and then just never use his account for years.
Yeah, seriously.
All right, guys. Thank you, Austin, again for having me on. You guys can go ahead and catch me on Twitter and Instagram at Nirvarize, Nirvarize. Go ahead and let's get it.